Good day, everyone, and welcome to another podcast of Government to Private. I'm your host, Eric Vento, and obviously it's been a while since we've done one of these. My apologies, but I am super excited about our guest tonight, Jim McConnell. Jim and I have known each other for a number of years, just like a lot of you on LinkedIn. We've never met in person, but we've kept up with each other. We've talked previously, and I'm well acquainted with his background. This is going to be a little bit different this evening in the fact that Jim didn't transition from the government, like law enforcement, the military, the intelligence community, et cetera, but he has a extensive breadth of experience across the corporate security sector. He currently runs his own company, and we're going to jump into a lot of different things over the next 30 to 45 minutes that are of intense interest to a lot of you. I regularly hear from you about, I want to hear more about this and I want to hear more about that. Well, tonight we're going to touch on a few of those topics. Jim, welcome to the podcast. I'm super happy you could be here, brother.
Eric, a true honor, sir, for all that you do for our industry and our heroes out there. And it is it's always about giving a perspective, not the only perspective that we all give. And as I tell people, take what we give to you, write it down and add it to other perspectives, and then build your own perspective out of it. And so I did not serve in the military, though it's a funny story of how they tried to get me. And I did not serve in law enforcement. My wonderful wife was former law enforcement, so I believe I'm part of that family. I am a volunteer first responder here in the DFW area, so love being part of that family and mentoring our military and law enforcement heroes as often as the good Lord allows. But yeah, 28 plus years at a Fortune 25 company doing corporate security. I'm one of those weird guys. I don't know why people still call converged security new, but I've been exposed to converged security for 30 plus years. My first job was locking up a church, and thus my passion for helping the faith-based community. And so the last 28 and a half years doing that, about 16 countries on the ground in those countries. And then and started in little cyber world, did some physical stuff, executive protection, just such a amazing opportunity to go across the boundaries of those things. And then probably about 10 years ago, start the opportunity to mentor law enforcement and military in their transition. So learned so much from the heroes that are out there and got to meet many of them. And so I am honored to be here and give what I have been blessed to give back into your audience.
Well, I greatly appreciate it, Jim, and I am looking forward to learning as well. Learning is a continuous thing that we do, and just like you mentioned at the beginning, it's a perspective, not the perspective. And we all need different perspectives to inform our lives, both personally and professionally, and just ensure that we're constantly learning. So jumping into it, brother, one of the biggest things that people who are transitioning from the government to the private, or just people who are looking in general for something new, they always ask, how can I get into security? I want to be in security, which obviously security is this massively broad area. And, you mentor law enforcement and other first responders on the side when they say, I want to get into security. So can you talk about that a little bit and how you approach that?
Yeah, so I start out with that question. I want to get into security, Jim, and I don't start it out with what do they think this path is, because what I want to do is show them a number of paths that they get to get out their proverbial highlighter. I remember there was a commercial by a certain a financial institution that used to show people walking down the street, and there was this green marker walking down the path. And so this is a path, this is a journey. But I really start them out with something as simple as, and I ask this of my mentees, I ask it of pastors, I ask it of corporate people, is what do you think is the difference between safety and security? And it's amazing, just those two simple words. People that have been in security and safety for a long time can't answer that question in a way that they pause, like, huh? And you get the whole thing. Let me look on the ceiling and go, that's a great question. And luckily, I'm not interviewing them for a job. But if you're struggling, if you think you know what those two terms are, they may have been what you lived in or worked in or believe, but what is it in the company that you're going to or you're
Yeah.
targeting? Whether it's military, back in the military, law enforcement, or in a corporate environment. If you can't figure out those two terms, wow, you think, well, Jim, there's industry standards around that. Try again. So I start out with those two terms, and then I start to step them through, and I don't jump into the tactical, technical things first, because you know what, I could read a bunch of that stuff and go to Wikipedia and blah, blah. So I start out with things like, what's the leadership path they want to go?
Yeah.
Eric, we know everybody's a leader. I got a 6-year-old that can be a leader. I talk about location. I talk about specialization versus being broad. I talk about the type of company they want to work for. I mean, how the Red Cross has a chief security officer. There's all kinds of different organizations that now do and have full-time security teams out there.
Yeah.
So those types of organizations, and then stepping through the operational things, stepping through some soft things, and of course, our favorite thing, associations and networking. But I start them out with this: build your Webster's dictionary. What is your Webster's dictionary for your experience and you're going into security or safety areas? And start that out. When I wrote my book, sitting over there, I spent more time on that chapter of definitions than any other chapter because I wanted to be consistent. And so start out with your definition of safety, security, converged, just a ton of words out there that you've got to kind of set out and do. And you may use somebody else's. You may hear something from Eric or I that you say, hey, I like that definition. Great. But you may say, oh, that's not what I'm experienced in. And so that way, when you go into an interview, you're able to translate what they are saying, or at least ask for clarification to convert it to what you live and breathe. It's about being consistent with your words.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, that's one of the questions that everyone struggles with, not just transitioning public servants, but just like, where do I even start? And probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give people is have as many conversations with people as possible. Specifically, the people who are in the positions that sound remotely interesting to you, who work at the companies that you would like to work for, whether by reputation, maybe they're local to you, whatever the case may be. Start having those conversations and ask them, like, hey, what do you do in your day to day? What is the culture of the company like? What's the workplace environment like? Do you feel like it's a healthy, productive culture, et cetera? Start having those conversations because, that's the inside baseball that you need to make an informed decision about, okay, how can I narrow my focus toward these specific areas, industries, jobs, et cetera? And, so many people are just like, wow, never thought about that before. And I always try to put it in examples that people can understand. But like, when you're trying to go into law enforcement, you do a ride along. You go, see what it's like at that specific agency, or go in there and you talk to a few officers off the books about like, hey, is this a good place? Am I going to succeed here? Are they micromanagery or whatever the case may be? And you get as much information as you can so that can inform wherever you decide to go. And it's the same thing in the private sector. If you don't know, or you don't know what you might like to do, pick something that sounds remotely interesting. Maybe it's the job title, maybe you read the job description, maybe someone gives you a referral to a different organization. Just have those conversations and really discover what it's potentially like day in and day out.
Yeah, and I tell people, you know, when you hear the term "find your passion," and some people love that term, some people hate that term, but I tell them that it's in different areas. Is your passion specialized or converge? Is your passion working for an NGO or is your passion working for as a sole proprietor? Is your
Yeah.
passion in loss prevention or is it in cyber? And so your passion is a set of Lego blocks. It's a set of the puzzle that puts it together. Your passion's not in one particular area. And so the example that I use sometimes is, if you've got a passion for, you found out about a company that for every 10 shoes that they sell, they give a pair of shoes away to the country that your mom and dad grew up in. And you're like, man, I just love their why. I am passionate about their why. Guess what? Start targeting them to see if you can go work for them for security, because
Exactly.
that passion is not just, I want to go help them with, I don't know, investigations. It's added on to investigations plus their why, plus other areas. Oh, they're also located in Thailand. Great. I love that country. So your passion is a puzzle of things. Put those pieces together, and where you think, I'm not sure what my passion is in that puzzle piece. Like you said, go start reading job description. Go start finding people that are passionate in that area.
Yeah, and I like that you bring that up because, when I worked in law enforcement, that was truly a passion. And some would argue, and I would now agree with them, that it was a borderline obsession. Like I lived and breathed that job 24/7. And it was something I intensely enjoyed. And it's something that I, got a lot of my identity and self-worth out of. Obviously that was not healthy at the time, but I didn't know that. And, you know, at the end of the day, passions change, and passions are, at least for me, they're heavily tied to perspective. Now I do think there's a difference between being passionate about something versus enjoying it. And
Absolutely.
so, my passion is taking care of my family and making sure that I go through as few layoffs as possible and maintain consistent stability throughout my professional career. Now, I would prefer that I like my job as much as possible because there's so many positives that come out of really enjoying what you do. But at the end of the day, that is not required. And so I think when people are new to the workforce or they're coming out of a career in law enforcement, they struggle with, I just don't know if I'm going to find something that I enjoyed as much as I did in law enforcement, whatever the case may be. And I think what I try to coach people on or just tell them is there's a lot of things that you can do that are very similar in terms of scope and impact. You know, one of the biggest things is what that I enjoyed about law enforcement is, especially when you're on the street and you're in a patrol car, you have that unique opportunity to have such an immediate, tangible impact on people's lives through very, very, I would say, very, very simplistic actions. Just pulling someone over on a traffic stop may change the entire trajectory of their day. You see that as normal, they do not. you know the difference between giving someone a ticket versus giving them a warning. There's so many, every action that you have during the course of your shift has a profound impact on the people that you are called to serve. And the same can be said of the corporate sector. We have different experiences and different perspectives that allow you to have same or similar impacts. It's just going to look differently. you know and I think being able to tell people that, hey, you can still have a significant impact, it's just going to look different than what it has for you in the past.
Yeah, if you don't know your why, discover your why. And if you were a police officer, what was those calls that you just walked away proud? Some of them you walked away sad, some of them you walked away proud. Part of those sub elements of that, you love hanging around with the crime scene people that picked up all the stuff. Okay, I can connect that, and so finding some of those whys. When I was in my previous life, was in the telecommunications world, so my why was very clear. And I tell this story a lot just because it helps people understand your why doesn't have to be like real PhD scientific. And it was this. What I was there to protect every day was the ability for when your grandmother picks up the phone and dials 911, that phone call works 100% of the time. That's number
Yeah.
one. Number two is when Johnny, the grandson, calls up grandma and says, Grandma, guess what? I got an award in school today. Aren't you proud of me, Grandma? That phone call works 100% of the time. There's not a lot more important than those two things if you live in the telecom world. Well, guess what? That sounds kind of like a little corny, but it gave me focus. And so when the
Yeah.
fires started popping up and the politics started popping up and whatever, it gave me focus. Now, you had that in law enforcement, you got it in the military. Now, figure out what that might be. And by the way, it might be a question in an interview. If you go to an interview with a company and they can't tell their version of grandma's story, you might question, what am I going to do here? If
Yeah.
the company can't explain their why for society and whatever else, recalculate. But if
Yeah.
you can sit there and go, hey, I think the why of X, Y, and Z is, man, that's something to grab onto.
Yeah. I love that. Because I think figuring out your why is such a integral part of whether a transition or a career is successful. I mean, public servants naturally gravitate toward, I'm going to do a job for less pay than the normal person would probably take. So I need to have something else that's driving me. And it's usually that why, that passion, that call to serve in some way, shape, or form. And that still exists in the private sector.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I love that. I really resonate with that, Jim.
Yeah. I mean, I love, even though I wasn't in law enforcement, man, I love training law enforcement. I'm an adjunct professor, adjunct instructor with Texas A&M TEACS. And man, I was just at a site this past week teaching. I'm teaching next week. And I love when law enforcement and military and first responders are in the room and just giving back what I've been giving. So, part of my passion is teaching. And part of that is for them to discover, oh, I never thought about that particular area.
Right.
And so the law enforcement officer that I had a mentoring session with this past week, she and I was in a CPTED class. For the ones that are not familiar with CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, take that class. And so she and I was in that class, and she says, you're in corporate. Can we talk one time? So we had a good 30-minute coffee break about what she needs to do going forward to think about her next steps.
Love that. And that kind of leads us into the next, I guess, discussion point is, you talked about building your resume bucket list. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah. So a number of years ago, when I became a first responder 5-6 years ago now, there was a lot of training that I needed to start taking, and both kind of process wise, people that are in that world know things like the NIMS ICS Incident Command System process. Great for you if you're in security. So you took those, but there was just kind of what's next? What's next? I didn't have a training plan for that world. And so started to build one, talked to my agencies. They were like, hey, if you want to grow here, you want to grow here. So I kind of dabbled in that and trying to figure out what that was. And it was just kind of like, this is just not structured. One, I can't budget for it that way. Two, I can't plan it out, et cetera. And I was like, and I'm not sure, just because they said for me to go do that class or if I'm interested, didn't connect the dots to my why and my goal. So I came up with this term called resume bucket list. From that kind of, if you ever seen the movie called The Bucket List, great movie.
Yeah.
But it's really around, what do I want my resume to look like in 2 years? And I use 2 years, arbitrarily. But what do I want my resume to look like in 2 years? Well, how do we create that? And so part of that is not just, you can't predict what projects you're going to be on. You may think about projects in the way of what you may volunteer for in your company or externally volunteer, but it really was around training and skills and knowledge. And so that resume bucket list for me was, okay, it's January 1st. Let me go pull some job descriptions. Let me look at what skills I didn't have over the last year, what skills that I have lost and
Yeah.
I have not sustained. So now I'm going to take a little spreadsheet. I'm going to take out over the next 12, 24 months, and I'm going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go renew this license. I'm going to drop a license because it's not worth it anymore. I'm going to go, for example, in 2 weeks, I'm going to get my OSHA training because there's been a lot of questions about certified safety people, safety skill sets, and I'm a security guy. So you know what? I'm going to spend 4 days, my own time, and going to an OSHA training class for 4 days. So that's part of my resume bucket list too, because that skill set of safety certification, true safety, is not anywhere on my resume.
Mm.
So it's taking your resume, taking some job descriptions, taking people you're talking to, stay away from that stuff that, oh, that would be neat to learn. Be careful, focus, prioritize on growth in your current position, your transition information, your job descriptions. Print off 20 job descriptions of cool stuff. Start highlighting what they have. Look at your resume. I have not done that. I don't have that skill set. I don't have that, whatever that gap is. Now build your resume bucket list. 2 years, some of that is an hour long something. Some of that is reading a book. Don't like reading books? Get an Audible version of it. But it's really around building that out. And every year I kind of move that 2 year mark. So January of next year, I'll relook and say, you know what? I didn't, because business was slow. I didn't get to 4 of the classes that I wanted to get to. Now, I don't automatically move those to next year. I do and say, do I still need those? How many times have I been asked about that? Okay.
Yeah.
And so I restart that list. So, no more than probably 10 or so on that list. Don't over stress yourself, but that's the resume bucket list. What do I want my resume to look like in 2 years? And this is where I kind of pick on some people. Stop depending on your employer to budget your time and your money for training.
Yeah.
You
Well
know,
said.
if you're a Dave Ramsey fan, if you're not a Dave Ramsey fan, get out that budget. You ain't got a budget. You don't need to be listening to Eric Jim right now. So if you got a budget, line item in there, resume bucket list, whatever it is, and put aside $2,000 to $5,000, whatever it is, and budget for it.
Yeah.
Now, if your company or you got grants or something like that that gets you some of your things off your resume bucket list, great. That's a blessing. But don't depend on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really resonate with that, because our careers are so linear, and when I started in the corporate world, I thought for sure that, my career was going to look like this, and realistically it's looked like this, a whole bunch of figure eights, and I know that's a pretty popular analogy, but it's so true because what you may think your career is going to look like in 2 to 5 years usually doesn't look anywhere close to that. And being able to constantly assess, okay, are these certifications working for me? Because that's one question I get a lot is, should I pursue a certification? And I usually just throw a question right back at them and say, well, is it going to help you achieve your goals? Or is it just something that someone recommended to you? Are you seeing it on job descriptions as a preferred requirement? And ultimately certifications cost money to get, they cost money to maintain. And so it's a financial, dependency, if you will, to have one or more certifications because you're investing money in the maintenance of those certifications. And but yeah, I really like what you said because the job market is constantly changing. We were talking about that before the call. And in my current role, I lead a global cyber exercise program for one of the biggest FIs in the US. And that's not something I would have thought I was doing 7 years ago, and it has nothing to do with, a lot of the skill sets that I obtained over the years, or the certifications that I got, et cetera. And so I'm in the middle of my own reassessment process right now of, okay, is what I'm currently spending my time and my financial resources on currently working out? And do I need to divert those resources elsewhere? And that's something that I think we should constantly be having a conversation with ourselves about, as well as with other people to see, hey, what's coming down the pipe? How can I prepare myself for A, B, C, and D? And so, one of those examples is from a cyber security perspective, that is not my background. I have very low technical acumen when it comes to cybersecurity. But from an exercise perspective, I depend heavily on the subject matter experts that I work with to help build the content for each exercise. But I also have recognized that that's one of my areas of improvement. And so right now, one of the certifications that I'm pursuing is the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner certification to gain additional skill and knowledge in an area that I need it in, because it's a direct reflection of my job. So, the resume bucket list that you are talking about is something that I call something different, but it's something that I still use every single day.
Yeah. So certifications, here's what I tell people. Full disclosure, a lot of people have heard of something called Security Plus. I helped create that, had the opportunity to provide some job aids into others. But here's what I tell people, and a great mentor of mine years ago says one is, when I go to certification, so I'm going to go get my OSHA certification in a couple of weeks. One is it's part of my resume bucket list. But guess what? I'm going there. Number one is I'm going to get a certificate. Hopefully, I'm going to learn some stuff, but I'm going to network there. Hello, I'm going to take business cards there. I'm going to take a copy of my book there. So I hope to be able to give it away and give away things like. But here's what I tell about certifications is it for me and for many others I've talked to, it forces me to keep learning.
Yeah.
And so you got to take the little letters off your business card and your resume if you drop them. So guess what? You say, well, that's not real relevant anymore. Okay, that's fine. Then guess what? What is relevant, and make something that forces you to keep learning and keep training. So CPEs are sometimes the most valuable part of certifications, less the letters. Though the letters are important, I've got a lot of them and proud of them type thing, and I've helped create some of them. But I love it in the first responder world. They don't have a lot of certifications. You've got there's a different term than a resume bucket list, but they've got, your red card. If you're a wildland firefighter, where I got trained, there's your red card. And guess what? There's my radio piece of that. Here's all my different pieces. And there are a lot of people that I don't have on there. And so the other part is, so this drives into for example, if you're going to an interview, say, hey, do you have a training pathways document for each one of your security roles? If they say, I have no idea what you're talking about, in other words, they're not going to be able to support your resume bucket list. That'd be a red flag for me.
Yeah.
And so another question for at the thing is, again, kind of how you're going to support me. Do y'all support training? Of course, they all support training. Yeah, but do you have a training pathways document, diagram, Visio drawing, napkin, whatever it is, for this role that I'm applying for how I can grow into other areas? And again, you get the glaze on the eye, man.
Red flag. Red flag.
Yeah. So that, not that that's going to match your resume bucket list. It could be, because they could be completely different, but at least says, hey, I'm now I've got something that I can adapt my resume bucket list to both personal, professional growth, and now, of course, corporate growth into where I am in that role. You combine those things, you got a great resume bucket list.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, asking if they have a professional development budget in place. Yeah. And, training pathways is usually synonymous with core competencies.
Sure.
And because, most of the people that I work with, or that I know and I interact with, we all want to grow in our professional careers. That growth is going to look different for every single person in terms of timeline, how long it takes, et cetera. But as long as you're growing and you still feel challenged, that's ultimately what matters,
Yep.
and, I just really, really appreciate the focus on the types of questions that we can ask in interviews to really tell us, is this a place where I can not only be relatively happy, but also is this a place that the company puts resources in place to facilitate my growth?
Yep.
You know, and that's I tell you, having worked for companies on on both ends of the spectrum, that's something that not a lot of people ask in an interview setting, and
Yep.
it's really, really important. Yeah, you mentioned your book off to the the right hand side there. Um, that this is one of the things I work with people so consistently about from a resume writing perspective is, usually when you're in, I say law enforcement, the military, the government, we're not usually keeping track of our wins. We're not keeping track of, oh, I did this really cool thing. Let me go ahead and write that down. So when you get to the end of your career or you leave for whatever reason, and all of a sudden you need a resume that you previously didn't know even existed, you're thinking, okay, what did I accomplish? Why does it matter? How do I translate that to the private sector? And so having these metrics that you can use to build a program or to ask for additional headcount or money or build additional resources is absolutely imperative to understanding who your audience is and how the corporate world looks at ROI. So can you jump through why you wrote that book and what its primary purpose is?
Sure. So the blunt reason was I was on a bunch of panels and podcasts and other professionals saying there's no metrics available for fill in the blank security function. There's no metrics available for physical security. There's no metrics available. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, all right, okay. I'm not a PhD in metrics. I'm not NIST. Anybody that's heard of NIST, they do metrics like for a living. So I work with those folks. They're amazing, brilliant PhDs in this stuff. And so I just kind of got tired of the excuses. In fact, there's a chapter in the book that's called "Excuses for Not Creating a Metrics Program," because I've heard a bunch of them, and they're still going on. But yeah, so that was part of it. Let's give a solution to the industry. May not be complete or perfect, but it's a perspective, and it's a set of solutions that people can stop making excuses that we as the industry, the security industry, broadly defined, cyber, physical, EP, LP, blah, 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 even some law enforcement in there, that we don't have a way to do metrics. And again, metrics are different than stats. Stats are those things that says I had 5 pieces of fraud, 6 pieces of fraud, 12 pieces of fraud. Those are not bad, but they're not metrics. So that was number one. Number two, if you haven't wrote a book in your life, go write a book because it's not for you. It's for the younger generation. It's for your kids. And so if you haven't watched Randy Pausch's The Last Lecture, encourage that in YouTube to watch that. And it really is around what you're doing at your point in life is about your kids and about the younger generation. So it was for them. In fact, I've given my book away to young people. And I say, you want to learn about security without learning all the technical stuff? Go bore yourself and read my book, and you'll see, oh my goodness, there's all these different areas. And so the book's got 525 metrics in it for the first edition. So I tell people it's okay to take my book and just tear the pages out for that section. And then give it to somebody. If you want an electronic copy of one of my chapters and you buy it, call me up. I'll send you a Word document so you don't have to retype them. So it's to give back into the industry. But really, really around it is I wanted to get this thing down to 2 things. One is I wanted to make it simple. I wanted to stop making metrics and dashboards and all that stuff hard because our executives are busy and they're the ones that give us money. And so, for example, one of the things I tell people is if your pretty dashboards that you are creating, vendors, do not fit on this thing called a cell phone, stop. because this is all the executives are carrying around. And if your pretty dashboard doesn't fit on here and they don't have to scroll 82 times to get to the metric that they need about your security, stop.
Yeah.
That won't work. So yeah,
Absolutely.
so the metric really is around the simple concept of red is bad, green is good. And I talk about pie charts. So how many cameras in your building are end of life? Okay. Simple, third grade, denominator and numerator. Make a pretty little pie chart. And red is the stuff that's end of life. Green is the stuff that isn't. Everybody can understand that graph. And so, do you want something more sophisticated later on? Great. If you need it, great. But if you can do metrics, you don't even have to buy my book or use my metrics. If you're going to do metrics, pie charts. Red is bad, green is good. Don't have 85 colors. The execs don't care about 85 colors. Some of your execs are colorblind, with all due respect to them. Red is bad, green is good. Just start there. If you can't get movement on your camera upgrades because a pie chart is not making them move more red into the green section of that pie chart, you have a different problem. And so that was really the passion around it was. And so for your own world, am I making a difference in this world? Do I have a metric? So I do a newsletter on LinkedIn that every single different domain that I talk about in my newsletter, I give you a new metric. And so executive protection, insider threat, supply chain, and I give you a metric every month. Most of them are not in my book, just ones that I've come up with and new. So I'm not the only guy in here. There's some areas in there. Jim, you don't have a metric on, you don't have a chapter on this in there. Call me. Let's create it together. I'm working on a next edition. I'll have over 1,000 metrics in my next edition coming out probably next year. So from a transition standpoint and a job search standpoint, numbers are powerful. Eric and I were looking at a resume right before the call. Powerful thing to do there. Let's mix in not just some stats, but let's all mix in some metrics. Percentages are kind of the third grade version of that. Doesn't have to be percentages, but you know what? Everybody understands those. No disrespect to the HR people and the people that are PhDs and CEOs. But if they don't get it with the simple stuff, don't get into all kinds of like sine waves and all that stuff I don't understand.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I constantly tell people is metrics are great, but you really need to provide the context behind the metrics. And
Yep.
one of the most common examples that I provide is, if someone has on their resume, has increased sales by 300% from year 2022 to 2023. It's like, yeah, that's a big number, but the question that I'm asking is, what was the original number?
Yeah.
And
What's the
then
denominator?
what steps did you take to get there? Because
$1
that's going to show
to $3.
exactly.
$1
That's going
to
to show me how you
$3.
think, and I ultimately want to know how you process, how you think, how you continuously, problem solve, because that's going to show me way more than, okay, you achieved this 300% increase, and so providing that context and, hey, I identified this problem, I implemented this solution, and this was the measurable result as much as we can show people before you even get to the interview of why you might be a good fit for a given role.
Scope.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always tell people, if you can't explain why the size of the pie chart is that size, numerically, then you have a problem with scope. And here's what your audience, and this is a little bit out of the job hunting side, but when you're presenting it to senior executives, here's what they assume in metrics and stats. They assume your data is perfect. It has no integrity issues, and it covers all. And as a great person that I know says, all in every language means all. And so that's what the executive sees when they see a graph. So guess what? Eric nails it just right, folks, from an audience standpoint. If I don't have at the bottom of that graph or some context there that says, ladies and gentlemen, the size of this pie chart is based on just the headquarters building, in Booger, Arkansas, and it does not include all of our locations. And it can be that caveat, whatever you want to call it, but it's around the scope. So they don't assume it's all, and they don't assume that the data is perfect. And they're going to be okay with that. Now, they may ask you, if they're smart, how do we get to all? And how do we get to closer to perfect data? Different conversation. And if they start asking questions like that, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because guess what? That means they're interested, and you get to go back and spend more of their money making this better.
Yeah, I regularly present to our senior executives at the SVP level or higher, and maybe one of these days I'll finally get it through my head. But when I'm creating my briefing materials, I usually have it down to like 2 PowerPoint slides max. And it's supposed to be as hard hitting, but also as easy to understand as possible to minimize a lot of questions and stuff like that. But sometimes we don't even make it past the first slide, and it's just important to keep in mind to understand who your audience is. Like one of the examples I give is like if you're working anti-money laundering, there's a term called KYC, know your customer. And I always say know your audience, because in understanding what it is they're looking for and the degree of brevity that they're looking for can make or break how quickly you rise in your professional career. Because if they can't understand in a very short blurb what it is you're trying to accomplish, what the problem is, and what decision point you need from them, then you've basically already lost that audience.
If they want to extend the meeting and the agenda because they're interested, don't worry, they will. Now you need to be prepared,
Right.
but ultimately, it's great when they say, "Hey, can we skip the next section and go and start digging a little bit deeper in it?" That's a beautiful position to be in. If they kind of go, "Thanks, Eric, that was great. Finance update."
Exactly. Yeah. Couldn't agree more, Jim. Well, as we wind down the podcast, I always like to give people a good, 5 minutes or so to wrap up with any final thoughts or anything that you really think people want to hear. Obviously that you do a lot of mentoring on the side. So I'm sure you get a ton of questions from people, some that are fairly consistent, some which may not be. And so, what is some information or what are some thoughts or advice that you have as we close this out?
Sure. First, particularly for our military and law enforcement first responders, thank you all for your service, your sacrifice, and for your family's sacrifice and service to our nation and our freedom. But it really comes down to uh, don't get so technically wound up in these things, in this adventure of these types of transition things or job searching things. Build your own Webster's dictionary. Build your resume bucket list. Keep those things dynamic. If you're doing training, whether it's certifications or licenses or none of the above, it's about getting the training. It's about networking while you're training. It's about sustainment. It's think of CPR, AED, first aid. I'm an instructor for those. As an instructor and as a practitioner, I've got to keep that going. It's like, oh man, I know that like the back of my hand. I don't care. And so keep training. If your company doesn't budget for it, it's the person in the mirror needs to budget for it. Resumes, I've heard it said recently, if you print it off a resume, you get 6 seconds above the fold. And so fold your resume in half. It's kind of like the old newspaper days. They call it above the fold. So you got 6 seconds there, 45 seconds for the full doc, your LinkedIn profile, 2 to 3 minutes. And so work on all of those and networking. And networking is kind of this broad, neat term. To me, networking is exactly what Eric talked about. Networking could be sitting down with a company or a role or a person that's an expert and just asking them some questions. By the way, don't be one-sided, give back. Networking could be volunteering at an environment. Network. I mean, I volunteer at a certain environment right now, and I give away CPTED reviews because I want to learn more about doing SEPTED, and I'm learning. So networking is so multifaceted. Chuck Andrews obviously has a great book on it. There's a number of things out there, but don't limit networking to any one thing that any of us say, because we all have different views of that. But those are the big things. If you're on LinkedIn, there's something called LinkedIn SSI. It's a metric you can use. It's not perfect, but try to find where you can measure your world. My resume bucket list is a measure. How am I doing how did I do at the end of the year? So put those all in there. Focus on the person in the mirror, and just keep learning. Keep learning. Keep giving. You've got so much to give. If that means giving back in blogs, if that means writing a crazy book like I did, if that means speaking at seniors centers and the Lions Club, like I do a family go bag class for senior citizens in the Rotary Club. It's all about giving, but it's all about networking. It's all about learning. Every time I speak, I learn. There's my final. Go do it. It's up to the guy in the mirror and the girl in the mirror.
I love it. You mentioned, the SSI, which for those of you, aren't on government benefits or anything like that, SSI for LinkedIn is Social Selling Index. And it basically measures how well you network on LinkedIn. And so it's measured across 4 different metrics, which is establishing your professional brand, finding the right people, engaging with insights, i.e. making meaningful posts, and then also building relationships by connecting and establishing trust with decision makers. And so, again, all of this is an indicator. All of these are steps that you can take. Some may work well, some may not work out so well, but you won't know until you do them. And the best thing about this, in my opinion, is that you're not alone in this process. There's a whole host of people who have been where you are. Their story may look a little bit different, but they have still been there. And don't hesitate to reach out and ask for help. The worst thing that can happen is someone says no, and you're no better off than you were before. So take that step of vulnerability, take that leap of faith, reach out and ask for help. I guarantee you that for the most part, you will be wildly successful in that venture. Jim, I really appreciate your time this evening. You've given us a lot to think about. You've dispensed a lot of pearls of wisdom, if I might add. And you've really reinforced a lot of what I'm doing, but I'm also going to take some of that and I'm going to go out there and learn a little bit more and shore up some of my areas of improvement from a resume bucket list. So thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us, and we greatly appreciate your time.
Eric, it's an honor. Thank you for all that you do for our industry and our heroes. And back for another topic in the future if you find a need or partnering on a different area. But again, my honor. Thank you very much. And for everybody out there, go do something.
Thanks, Jim.